as he talks about a new relationship with countries, let us also involve these countries of Latin America. Let us have President Obama close the school.
Father Roy Bourgeois, the legislation that you say was passed in the House now has to be reconciled with the Senate version, which doesn't have this amendment that would require the release of names that you at School of the Americas Watch have relied on before the 5 years that you haven't been able to get them all of these years to show the connection between what these soldiers do when they go home. Just a little background on Father Roy Bourgeois for our listeners and viewers. First went to School of the Americas soon after Archbishop Oscar Romero was gunned down, assassinated March 24th, 1980. And you took a boombox and went onto the base and broadcast the last words of Oscar Romero, the speech that he gave specifically to the Salvadoran soldiers, urging them to, saying, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression. You broadcast his voice, and you were arrested and served 1.5 years in prison. But when did you actually set up SOA Watch right outside School of the Americas? I don't think most people know about the Jesuits killed. I don't think most people know about the 4 churchwomen in El Salvador that were killed.
Amy, a small group of us came to the main gate of Fort Benning at the beginning of 1990. It was right after the massacre of 6 Jesuits in El Salvador, well-known Catholic priests walking with the poor there in their struggle, along with their 2 women co-workers. We were pumping a lot of money into El Salvador, about $1 million a day at this time, into their military. A U.S. Congressional Task Force went to investigate the massacre of the 2 women and the 6 Jesuits, came back reporting that those responsible were trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning. That's when I went down, set up camp. I continued to live since 1990 in a small apartment right outside of the main gate of Fort Benning. Was joined by some friends, Charlie Litke, Kathy Kelly, and a few others. And that began our movement. We started to do research, and it didn't take long for us to discover that in our backyard there was a school of assassins, a school that trains terrorists, really, in Latin America, all paid for, millions of dollars being pumped into this school today. Is all coming from our tax money, millions of dollars. And we want that money to go into, projects for the poor, for the elderly, for healthcare, right here in our own communities. Our movement has grown from 10 in the early days. Every November, we gather at the main gate for our vigil to call for the closing of the school, to express our solidarity with the people of Latin America. I'm happy to report that this last November, about 20,000 gathered. Students, veterans, lots of nuns, parents come with their children, and we welcome people to be with us in November to get more information, of course, about the issue in our upcoming vigil in November. I ask our viewers to simply go to soaw.org. One other thing, I just want every morning I get up, I open my blinds, I look right across the street, there's Fort Benning. 2 chain link fences with these signs. I carry this around with me that says, no trespassing. And beyond these signs and the razor wire that reminds me of some of the prisons that we have been sent to, those who protest the school, there is the School of the Americas, called now WINSEC. They say they're teaching democracy there. Well, we say you do not teach democracy behind the barrel of a gun. You cannot teach democracy behind a sign that says no trespassing. And this is our problem. This is not a school for democracy. There's no transparency here. And we're calling really on President Obama and more people now to really look at this school for what it is. It is a school of torture. It is a school for dictators. It is, most of all, a school of coups.
Father Bourgeois, I would like to bring in our 3rd guest here on this topic, Nicholas Kozloff, author of Revolution, South America, and the Rise of the New Left. Nick, Zelaya was not seen when he first was elected as any kind of a populist or a radical. Could you talk about his trajectory and what happened to him in his time in office, that he has now become sort of the standard bearer of the masses of Honduras?
Sure, you're right. I mean, Zelaya is a member of the business elite in Honduras. He's part of the Liberal Party, which is one of the two major parties in Honduras. And initially, he had supported the free trade agreement with the United States. But around 2007, 2008, as the region started to shift leftwards in South America, and you had the rise of Daniel Ortega of the Sandinista Party in Nicaragua, and Mauricio Funes in El Salvador of the FMLN, Zelaya started taking some more progressive positions, and most importantly in the foreign policy arena. Honduras has had traditionally very strong ties to the United States, strong military ties. When Zelaya started to embrace Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, that was hugely controversial amongst the Honduran elite and the media there. This represented a sea change in Honduran politics. Shortly thereafter, Hugo Chavez inserted himself into the local milieu. He came to Tegucigalpa, and there was a huge rally in support of something called the Bolivarian Bolivarian Alternative of the Americas. It's Chavez's answer to the U.S.-imposed free trade agreements in the region. And Zelaya had come out in support of the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, and so this set him at odds with the United States. And there was a history of friction between the U.S. and Zelaya leading up to the coup. And so I think if you were just reading the reports in the mainstream media, you might get the impression that this coup is just about term limits in Honduras, and it's just a conflict over whether Zelaya will be able to extend his constitutional mandate of 1 4-year term. And my point is that there is an ideological component to this coup. What did the coup plotters do when they came into power? They roughed up the Venezuelan ambassador. They threatened and harassed journalists working for Telesur, which is a satellite news network that's run by Uruguay, Argentina, Cuba, and Venezuela. So there's a definite ideological component to this. And Roberto Micheletti, the new president, had actually opposed many of these foreign policy reorientation that Zelaya had favored in recent years.
Didn't he also, Zelaya, take other stands that were diametrically opposed to U.S. policy? For instance, he began coming out questioning whether the drug war was a legitimate war and there should be possible legalization of drugs. And also, didn't he raise the minimum wage substantially in a country where there's a lot of free trade zones and people working in factories for foreign companies?
Well, right. I mean, the first salvo against the Honduran elite was his moves to raise the minimum wage by 60%. And you're right. I mean, this is a country where you have these maquiladora assembly plants, and the Honduran elite were, to say the least, displeased by the moves. And then after that, he started taking some very controversial foreign policy initiatives. Probably most controversially, as you point out, criticizing the U.S. war on drugs. And that's not surprising, given that in recent years, drug violence has exacted a heavy toll in Honduran society. You have these drug gangs that carry out gruesome attacks, beheadings, eye gougings, very gruesome kinds of tactics. And so Zelaya actually called for the legalization in order to lessen the violence in Honduras. And then the U.S. ambassador, the outgoing U.S. ambassador, Charles Ford, remarked as he was leaving Honduras that, actually, remittances of Hondurans to Honduras are mostly drug-related. As I think that was a sort of punishment against Zelaya for taking unpopular foreign policy initiatives. And then that just prompted Zelaya to shoot back that the U.S. is responsible for a lot of the drug violence in Central America.
Finally, Nick, the letter that President Zelaya wrote to President Obama.
Well, I think it's a very audacious move for the leader of a small Central American nation to write Obama personally. And this was in December of 2008, right after the election, but even prior to the inauguration. not only did he criticize U.S. foreign policy in this letter, but what I think is really interesting is that he made it public because he was upset by some of the remarks that the former U.S. ambassador had made. And in his letter, he criticized the intervention as policies of the U.S. ambassador.
米州人権委員会はホンジュラスに現地調査団を送って100名以上の人々から聞き取り調査をし、8月に実態についての報告書を発表しました。それによると、クーデター後の政権や警察、軍隊などが中心となって過度の強制力を行使した結果、少なくとも4名が死亡し、拉致・強制失踪が懸念される人々もいるほか、拷問なども行われ、何百人もの人々が障害を負ったということです。その他、女性に対する性暴力やメディアへの攻撃などの違法行為がまかり通っていることも米州人権委員会の報告は明らかにしています。